They expected to find a frozen camp and the wreckage of a routine medevac gone wrong. What they approached instead stopped them in their tracks, a scene that would be described later in the hushed tones of men who had seen too much. The rescue team recoiled, not simply because of what they found, but because everything about it forced a single, terrible question. How far can people be driven before the rules that govern us change? To answer that, we have to rewind to a place most people never see, the windswept white emptiness around Cambridge Bay in Nunavut, where a single small aircraft can mean the difference between life and death. In that landscape, distances are measured in hours and hope. Communities rely on charter pilots and light aircraft to move patients, supplies, even entire families. Those pilots work in a world of thin margins, fuel, weather windows, and the pressure to make a trip that brings both pay and responsibility. On November 8th, a flight took off under those margins. The pilot was Martin Hartwell, a man with experience in northern flying, but without the formal instrument rating that would have allowed him to rely on cockpit instruments when visibility failed. On board were the people who would make this flight one of the most discussed survival stories of its era. Neme, an Inuk woman who was pregnant and urgently needed to reach medical care. Judy Hill, a nurse accompanying the patient. A young boy, David Kutuk, just 14, who was ill and in need of attention, and a handful of others. Records show that another pilot, Ed, had been asked or considered for the job and declined. There was a sense of urgency that pushed routine caution aside. For all the ordinary bravery of northern pilots, they depend on equipment that the rest of us seldom think about. In this case, the beacon at Contwoito Lake, a navigational aid, would prove crucial and critically flawed. Investigators would later note that the beacon was weak. The airplane's compass moved erratically that day. Small problems stacked against real dangers. The weather closed in, light faded, and instruments that might have saved the flight were either absent or unusable in the conditions Hartwell faced. Those details are not breathless accusations. They are the technical threads that lead to the crash. The final moments before impact are described in short, urgent fragments in the records. A cabin light that ought to have stayed off is remembered as on. The pilot fought to maintain orientation as the ground rose where it shouldn't. The Beechcraft came down hard. The crash killed Judy Hill almost instantly and fatally wounded Neme. Martin was seriously injured, with both legs broken and movement severely restricted. David, the 14-year-old, survived, but not without injuries that would complicate the days ahead. They made what shelter they could. The camp they built was small against the enormous sky. A torn canvas, some scattered supplies, tins of food, a fishing kit that went unused, a tarp flapping in an Arctic wind. They had candles and a limited supply of rations, and the slow arithmetic of survival began. Melted snow provided water after painstaking work. Hours took on new meaning when the nearest town was hundreds of miles away and help depended on being seen. At first, the story of survival is almost ordinary in its details. David and Martin shared what they could. Martin, despite his injuries, remained lucid at times and dependent on David's help. It is documented that David made repeated attempts to seek help. He scoured the surrounding terrain, trying to reach any sign of civilization, returning weakened and discouraged. Each time he left, the others watched him go with worry that is almost a physical thing. But supplies ran down. Candles were eaten for a caloric boost. Snow had to be melted more carefully as temperatures dropped. The days blurred. Food tins were opened and emptied. Night after night the canvas shuddered with wind, and the sound of engines passed far above, sometimes hopeful, sometimes not. The small camp became, for those inside it, an entire world. Back on the broader stage, search and rescue forces mobilized. Twin Otters, Hercules aircraft, civilian pilots, and local volunteers scoured vast tracts of frozen water and barren land. The effort was massive and expensive, and it was also fallible. For 19 days, teams pushed to find the downed plane. On November 27th, amid dwindling leads and mounting expenses, the official search was suspended. Families and friends were left with a silence that felt full of possibility and dread. Not everyone accepted that suspension. Susan Haley, Martin's girlfriend, became a persistent voice demanding the search continue. Her advocacy is an important chapter in the story. Her insistence, the petitions, the pressure on officials, these threads brought renewed attention. Signals were reported and followed up. Pilots like Ken Moody would later play roles in the search efforts. The story of the search reads like an alternation of hope and disappointment, each turning into the next as days passed. Amid these wider actions, inside the camp, the arithmetic of survival continued to worsen. David, young but increasingly responsible, tried again to fetch help and supplies. On December 1st, he died. The cause is recorded as starvation and exhaustion. The exact internal experiences of his final hours cannot be reconstructed, and any attempt to narrate his thoughts would be speculation. What matters is not guesswork about his private moments, but the facts. He tried, he failed to return. And when he did not, the light that kept the small group going disappeared with him. After David's death, the remaining man in the camp, Martin, himself grievously injured, wrote what the records call a letter, a resignation of sorts, a note that prepared for death. The days stretched into what felt like months. Then, when the world above had almost stopped turning for these men, a new search began that would change everything. The final phase of the rescue is where the title of this story finds its center. Paratroopers and search teams finally closed in on the coordinates of the camp. Planes approached. Men stepped out onto the frozen plain and walked toward the ragged shelter. What they found there was a scene that would haunt those who saw it and shape the public memory of the event. Rescuers discovered Martin alive, in need of urgent medical attention. They also found Judy Hill's body, and evidence that it had been consumed. The official phrasing is careful. Rescuers found Judy's remains, showing signs that she had been eaten. Those words, even measured, carry shock. They forced people to ask questions that are both practical and moral. Who had done this? Under what circumstances? Had it been a deliberate choice, or a choice made in unimaginable desperation? The first words Martin reportedly spoke to the rescuers were as stark as the scene. "Welcome to the camp of a cannibal." He said it, according to accounts, as a confession in a moment between pain and explanation. That line became a hinge for public reaction. It was also, in context, the desperate utterance of a man who had been injured, isolated, and near death. The discovery terrified the rescue team because it exposed the raw conflict between survival and moral law. It also forced an immediate practical response: treat the living, document the scene, and move into the next phase of care. Martin was evacuated, flown to medical facilities, and treated for his injuries and the effects of prolonged exposure. The rest of the official response turned to fact-finding and to questions about the chain of events that put these people in that place at that time. An inquest followed. It examined technical factors: the weak beacon at Contwoito Lake, the pilot's lack of an instrument rating, the compass oscillation, as well as systemic ones, such as the practices and pressures of Gateway Aviation, the charter company that operated the flight. The inquest's findings are part of the public record. They point to a confluence of human error, equipment failure, and the unforgiving environment of the Arctic. The airline's practices were scrutinized. Regulators and the company faced questions about whether procedures and maintenance had been adequate. Among the concrete outcomes was a technical correction. The power of the Contwoito beacon was doubled. It was one of those small but decisive changes that followed a tragedy, the kind of adjustment that can save lives in the future. Other consequences were personal and administrative. Martin Hartwell's pilot's license was revoked. He never regained his old flying status. These are documented consequences, not moral verdicts. They reflect accountability in a narrowly legal and regulatory sense. The human aftermath remained complex. David Kutuk, the boy whose courage and effort were central to the story, was remembered in a way that recognized the scale of his sacrifice. He was posthumously awarded a recognition for his actions, the Meritorious Service Cross, a rare honor that underscored the depth of his courage and the way his presence in those final days shaped what happened. Families mourned. Communities grappled with grief that was both personal and public. Discussion of culpability was directed by the inquest's findings. There was no simple villain in a story composed of layered failures and hard choices. The rescue team's discovery did not produce clear moral absolutes that could be settled by headlines. Instead, it left a series of difficult truths. A pilot unprepared for instrument flight, a weak beacon that made a deadly difference, a pattern of decision-making under pressure, a young boy who did more than anyone might have expected, a nurse who died in a crash, an indigenous woman who did not survive her injuries and whose family would live with loss. Respectful reporting of what was found at the camp required particular care. The word cannibalism surfaced in statements and headlines, and Martin's own words fed public fascination, but the language chosen in official records was precise. Judy Hill's remains bore signs that she had been consumed. That phrasing deliberately avoids lurid detail while still conveying what the rescue team saw and what investigators documented. It is a balance between truth and dignity that the inquest and subsequent reporting strove to maintain. The ethical complexity of the situation remained. Some asked whether Martin should be held personally or criminally responsible for what had occurred. Others pointed to the broader system that put the flight in danger. The inquest did not offer a neat, comprehensive moral judgment that satisfied every observer. Instead, it documented facts, technical shortcomings and administrative failures, and it left the public with a question that resists reduction. When survival strips away comfort and certainty, how do we judge the acts that follow? Alongside the legal and technical aftermath, there were quieter legacies. Memorials grew up around the names of those who died. David's recognition would become a way to honor the boy who had stepped beyond what anyone expected of him. Neme's daughter survived. Her life carried the consequences of what had been lost. Judy Hill's name remained in the records and the remembrances of those who knew her. Communities in the North, often resilient and private, felt the ripple effects of attention, not only the scrutiny, but also the way outside systems touched their lives. For Martin, survival carried its own heavy burden. He returned to a life shaped by injury, by the weight of what had happened, and by administrative penalties. His license revoked, he could no longer simply step back into the cockpit of a plane and fly away from the memory. Records note his later life in factual terms: the loss of his career, the public notoriety, the contested narratives. He was not a single-dimensional figure of blame or of heroism, but a man whose choices and misfortunes became part of a larger story. There are practical lessons here, too. The doubling of the Contoito beacon's power is an example of how tragic outcomes can bring focused improvements. Training standards, instrument ratings, and the maintenance of critical navigation aids became topics of renewed attention. For search and rescue organizations, the case reinforced the need for persistence and for listening to advocates who press for continued efforts when official resources wane. The scene that once terrified the rescue team also forced a more humane response, a demand to remember the people at the center, not the lurid elements of their ordeal. David is remembered for the courage he showed in those final days. Judy is remembered for her role as a nurse who had set out to help. Neme is remembered as a mother whose life and the life of her child were cut short. Martin is remembered as a pilot whose experience and limits were part of the accident's causes. Each person is, in records and remembrances, a figure of dignity, not a prop in a sensational story. When we step back from the specifics, the incident asks us to confront uncomfortable questions about systems and humanity. How do we weigh the responsibility of a company against individual choices? What obligations do communities and governments have to ensure that the tools and procedures for safety are in place? How do we speak about acts that, if viewed outside of context, shock the conscience? And how do we keep compassion at center stage when we do? The rescue team's reaction was the emotional pivot because it compressed all these questions into a single moment. They had trained for hazard and seen death, yet what met them was an ethical and emotional puzzle that would not be answered by first aid alone. Their recollection of stepping back captures the human limit. People can handle danger, but the idea that desperation can upend the conventions that bind us is what unsettles us most. There is a final, quieter legacy worth holding. Beyond policy changes and inquests, the personal memorials persist. David's posthumous decoration serves not to salve guilt, but to acknowledge bravery and loss. Communities marked names and built small monuments to keep memory alive. Documents, hearings, and adjusted beacons are the institutional footprints. The lives altered are the human core. This story, at its heart, is not a tale of sensational acts, but of conditions that produce desperate choices. It asks us to trace the path from a weak beacon and a pilot's limits to the small interior economies of a wrecked canvas and a dwindling tin of food. It asks that we see human beings who made choices in extremity and that we treat those choices with both factual rigor and moral humility. If this account moves you, there are ways to learn more and to honor those affected. Check the sources linked below for the official inquest documents and memorial pages. Consider supporting search and rescue foundations that work year-round to prevent similar tragedies. And remember David Kutuk, Judy Hill, Naomi, and the rest, not as curiosities, but as people whose lives call us to better systems, better preparation, and a deeper compassion for those who live and work at the edges of the map. The rescue team's recoil came from more than a single discovery. It came from the collision of human need and human fallibility, from the sight of lives pared down to their stark essentials, and from the knowledge that, in that wind-slashed place, small failures can have the largest consequences. The discovery at the camp terrified because it asked each observer to answer the hardest of questions. What would I do if all the rules were gone? The answer to that question is not simple, but the memory of what happened at that isolated camp can be put to use. It can drive technical fixes, it can sharpen training, and it can remind us to listen to survivors and to those who advocate when official searches end too soon. And it can keep at the center the names of those who were lost or who tried to save others. David Kutuk, remembered for courage beyond his years. Judy Hill, a nurse who did not live to tell the end of this story. Naomi, a woman and mother whose absence mattered to those who loved her. And Martin Hartwell, whose life after the crash remained shaped by the winter of his survival. The Arctic keeps its own calendar of silence and light, and in that vastness, the small acts of courage and the failures of systems both become indelible. The rescue team's shock was the moment when those truths could no longer be contained as statistics or procedural footnotes. They stood on the snow and understood, in a visceral way, the cost of everything that had gone wrong. If you want to read the official records and memorial pages that inform this account, you'll find links in the description. They offer the careful, sometimes painful facts that ground this story. And if you follow real survival stories, subscribe for more careful, respectful accounts of events that push humanity to its limits.